Okay, hello everybody, and thank you for coming. Today I'm going to be talking about same-sex sexual behavior in animals. I would like to start off by thanking the supervisor that I had for this project, Professor Nicola Marples. She was great. Um, and also I would like to give a bit of a content warning. There will be discussions of animal sex during the rest of the talk, so if that's not your thing, if that kind of weirds you out, I'd suggest going to somewhere else for the next 12 minutes. So let's start by talking about same-sex sexual behavior in general. For the research that I did, we sort of defined it as any reproductive behavior that you could sort of expect between different sex in a way that it would be beneficial towards reproduction. There's a book called Biological Exuberance that I will talk about more in a couple minutes, that has a list of 5 different types and the definitions. And so those 5 types are same-sex sex, which is pretty obvious, same-sex courtship, which is the ritualized dance or set of behaviors that is to attract a potential mate, same-sex pair bonding, which is pretty self-explanatory as well, same-sex affiliation, which was originally called same-sex affection, but that was a bit too anthropomorphized for us, so we changed it. And then same-sex parenting, which is also not necessarily raising offspring, but could be like preparing for raising offspring, that sort of thing, like building a nest or something. And so these are the sort of behaviors that we categorize as same-sex sexual behaviors. So let's talk a bit about the history of this behavior now, or how we've studied it at the very least. In roughly 300, 400 BC was when the first record we have of this behavior was found by Aristotle, who noticed that pheasants and quails had males mating together. It wasn't until 1900 when Ferdinand Karsh-Hawk published the first scientific review, and at that point, these behaviors in animals were sort of seen as a ability to make a moral argument for the behavior in humans. So Karsh used it as an argument for animals do this, why shouldn't humans be able to? Whereas other researchers would call this, sexual abhorrencies or deviancies. I think my favorite was the moral decline in butterflies, which is, absurd. And then in 1999, Biological Exuberance, which is this book right here, was published. I would recommend it. It's very good. It's by Bruce Bagamill. And it is a compendium of all sorts of the different behaviors that we've found in animals. It talks about the 5 different types of behaviors we have. And in every animal at that point that it had been found in. It's sort of written, there's a part for people who are curious, and then there's a part for academic people as well. And then another notable publication was in 2009, which was a paper on the potential for the evolution of this behavior by doctors Marlene Zuck and Nathan Bailey. So now we're going to get into some examples, which is probably the funnest part. Giraffes. So giraffes are sort of the first thing that you kind of think of when it comes to same-sex sexual behaviors, especially in mammals, because there is a certain study that states that 94% of male sexual interactions in giraffes is with another male. And this is sort of because there was maybe some issues with the methodology of the paper, but also because these animals have a certain estrous cycle for the females, which means that the females are only in the mood to copulate, or they don't really copulate outside of their certain time. And so instead of mating with the females when they don't want to, the males will just mate with each other instead, which is a common thing to be found amongst many mammals. Ostriches are also quite interesting because the male-to-male courtship ritual is different than the male-female courtship ritual, which is important when it comes to current hypotheses, because sometimes people will say that same-sex sexual behavior is just misdirected sexual behaviors. But the fact that there is the pirouette, which is a courtship ritual between male ostriches, it's just for the males as well. So that means that this behavior has developed on its own at some point as well. We also have the Amazon molly, which is quite similar to the whiptail lizard. Both of these species are parthenogenetic. And so that is a very long word that just basically means that these two species at the very least, are all female, and they clone themselves. So they don't have sexual reproduction, except it's not necessarily asexual either. And so these species all have same-sex sexual interactions because there's only one sex. In whiptail lizards, depending on their hormone cycle, they'll be taking different positions during sex. And it could be also potentially thought that sex initiates the reproductive cycle and the creation of the egg in the lizards. However, in the Amazon molly, there are a bunch of other species of fish that often live near the molly. And what the mollies do is they mate with a species that is similar but distantly related to them that has a male. And the presence of the sperm will initiate the creation of the egg. However, there's still no genetics from the male that had the sperm input. And the necessity of different sex reproduction in this species doesn't preclude same-sex sexual interactions from happening. The last example that I'm going to give today is the field cricket, it's called a feminized male, which is a male that lacks a lot of the male typical characteristics. In this case, it's sort of the wings and that sort of thing. The ability to make noise is also a non-feminized male characteristic. And what these feminized males will do is they will trick the non-feminized males, into mating with them. And in insects, oftentimes, the energy that it takes for a male to mate with a female or a feminized male that they are being tricked into thinking is a female is significant. And it will preclude them from mating with other individuals, which is a benefit for the feminized male if they can remove somebody from the competition. The presence of same-sex sexual behavior in insects has a widely accepted hypothesis, which isn't necessarily true for any other taxonomic group. It's called the mistaken mate hypothesis, which is basically just the cost of being able to tell the difference between two different sexes within a species it's quite difficult to do. So a lot of insects they'd rather mate with whoever and risk a same-sex mating rather than put the energy in to determine male versus female. So for my research, I had a list of about 391 species. There's a lot more insects that have this behavior, but I couldn't find enough data to include them in my research. So it was a lot of mammals, birds, there were some reptiles and insects, and arachnids and an octopus as well. So each species of the 5 categories that I talked about earlier of same-sex sexual behavior, I kind of knocked off each one if it was present in that species. And then I categorized each species for parental care, social structure, and group size. From that, I also looked at the taxonomies of it and separated each into the groups. And I made interaction networks to visualize taxonomic trends. An example of the interaction network would be this right here. This is an insect interaction network for social structure. And you can tell by the high levels of same-sex sex and same-sex courtship and the lack of almost any other same-sex sexual behavior that it upholds the mistaken mate hypothesis. There were also bar plots that I made for general patterns across all taxonomic groups. So this is an example of same-sex sexual behavior against parental care types. The end result of this research was to show that same-sex sexual behavior is expressed differently across taxonomic groups, and it is impacted by parental care, social structure, and group size. The most important thing is that this is not an anomaly, or it's not an anecdotal behavior. It's something that has been, that has pressures that encourage its presence in populations, it's been treated historically as an anomaly. So this can hopefully lead to more research to determine the reason behind these behaviors. Examples of the research that needs to be done is individual expressions. So does an animal prefer same-sex interactions, or does it prefer different sex, and the ratios of these different individual expressions within populations, the variations between populations, and looking at the different impacts that different pressures have on these expressions within the same species. And also something that I really found interesting was the presence of orgasm as a factor in social bonding, because just the endorphins that are caused by, or that are released when an orgasm happens, might lead to more social bonding. So bonobos are a great example of this. Sex is a very social tool in that species. And so maybe species that have orgasms are more likely to have same-sex sexual behaviors. And so I'm just going to quickly talk about my own experience, which is quite short because I am an undergrad. Basically, my only experience in research is this project, which was an incredible experience. I was very lucky. Not only did I get my first choice from my supervisor, but she was amazing. When I approached her and I asked her if I could do this project, she was supportive the entire time and helped me figure out what I wanted to do next year, which I will be continuing on to a PhD. I'm incredibly lucky to have had her as a supervisor, and also for the PhD supervisor that I'm going to have. I think part of the reason that my experience in this area has been so good is because I'm researching something that would probably be mostly the interest of LGBT people. And even if not, people have shied away from the area because they were afraid of other people thinking that they were gay. So, the people in this research area have to either be okay with being thought of as being gay or actually are queer in some way. So thank you all for coming. And now for questions, I guess.